Hi everyone, it's Lou from CraftStash, and today I'd like to talk you through 5 different techniques for lining up your stamps and coordinating dies. Now this is an issue many of us have. We've actually scoured the internet and we have found 5 fantastic tips from all your favourite expert crafters and popped them into one video for you. Let us know in the comments which one is your favourite. Now, as I say, you may have seen these techniques before, but you may not have, and there may be some from other crafters that actually suit your crafting style better. Now, the first one I'm going to be focusing on is probably the one that I use the most, and it comes originally from Heartfelt Creations. So Emma Lou at Heartfelt Creations explains in her video how you're best to make a template, which I actually think is a fantastic idea. I use this technique an awful lot, and it's actually one of the better ideas if you have solid dies. So for example, like this one, I don't have any way of visualizing through the die where I'm placing it over the stamped image. So the first thing I'm going to do is create a template for each of my dies that coordinates with my stamps. And I've heard another tip which I think is just genius, is to cut them out from a different coloured cardstock as well, so it's really easy to see where you're lining it up on your base card. So I'm just going to use a little bit of low tack tape, and I use the Creative Craft Products low tack tape, and it comes with a dispenser and a few rolls of tape, all for about £4.99. Fantastic value and well worth stocking up on that. And I just tape my die down into the centre of a square of coloured cardstock and run this through my die cutting machine. Now the GSM of the cardstock or the paper that I've gone through, this one is around about 190. It's not a heavyweight cardstock. In an ideal world, I'd like to be able to leave my template in place and still die cut through the card underneath. So effectively it needs to be able to go, the die needs to be able to go through kind of 2 bits of cardstock. If this is too thick or too heavy, the blades or the cutting edges on the die just aren't going to reach the cardstock or paper underneath. So a lightweight cardstock, but as you'll see in a moment, we actually need something that's got enough thickness to feel where we're putting the die. So now I'm going to use my Creative Craft Products stamping platform to stamp my image at this stage. Now it's well worth looking at the Creative Craft Products tools. We've just had some new items released. They are amazing products and fantastic prices. We'll make sure they're linked down below for you. And if you are going to be stamping and then die cutting really quite quickly, you need something that's super fast drying, such as a dye ink. An example of this is a Memento ink pad. You can find lots of different types of inks and ink pads available at CraftStash too. This particular stamp is from Sheena and it's called Heartfelt Christmas. That's the collection name. Again, you'll find this and all the other stamps and dies that I'm using available at CraftStash. And if you are a VIP member, don't forget you're also going to be saving 10% on everything I show you too. Now I'm going to reuse the bit of tape that I had on my die, and I'm going to pop down my template over the top of my stamped image there. Now, like I say, if you've used a dye ink, your stamped image should dry really quite quickly and you shouldn't have any problems with smudging your image. So we want to just place this over the top, and this is where our die outline will be. So of course different manufacturers will give you different sizes of outlines around your image. This is really quite a small one, which is great for us for the end result, but of course it does mean that's a little bit harder for us to line up. This makes it so much easier. So I think I've got a pretty good border all the way around the edge there. I'm just going to put my tape down, ensuring it has stuck to the base card, and then what I can do is I can place my die inside there and give it a wiggle, and as you give it a wiggle you should feel where that drops back into the space that you've die cut. When you can't move it anymore with your finger like so, that's in there. A second piece of low tack tape is really helpful here. That's just going to adhere that down and make sure it doesn't move anywhere. Now we can run this through our die cutting machine once more. Just check the back as always to ensure that has cut all the way through, and now we can lift up our die gently, of course, if you want to preserve the low tack tape for another time. Lift off your stencil, and don't forget, of course, to keep this mask or stencil, probably keep it with the tape on as well. Put it in the box or the bag or the packet where you keep your dies and stamps, so you've got it to use another time. and then pop your die cut image out, and you'll see this has cut absolutely perfectly around the edge. So thank you, Heartfelt Creations, for that tip. Now let's move on to the next one. Now this next hack is from Catherine Pooler, and it's actually the opposite of what we've just seen, and it's actually die cutting and then stamping afterwards. So Catherine Pooler explains in her tutorial how she actually die cuts the image first and then applies the stamp. This is great again if you do have solid dies, not just the outline dies, because this is just going to help you with your lining up later on. Of course, the snag is that you do need to ensure it's kept really still in your stamping platform, but we'll come to that bit in just a moment. So I'm just going to tape my die down onto my piece of cardstock that I want to stamp onto later. Because I'm going to be stamping onto this, I've actually chosen a smooth cardstock. If you choose a textured cardstock, your stamping is never going to be perfect. And as I'm actually stamping a zebra here with solid black stripes, I need this to be a really clear image. So there's my shape that's come out of my die. Now I can pop my die away. The die cutting around that shape is done, unless I want to do it anymore. Again, I always preserve my low tack tape. And again, I'm going to be using my trusty Creative Craft Products stamping platform, but of course I can't put my magnets on my image because that's exactly where I need to be stamping. So for this, we need to hold our image down. Now there's two ways of doing this. If you hold on to the end, I'm going to show you my way of doing this, but Catherine's is equally as effective. And it's just with a tiny little bit of glue or tape, something that you can just low tack that down onto your stamping platform. I like to stamp onto a rubber mat, so that's where mine's going, and something that doesn't have any dimensions, so the fact that I've used a flat tape means that's not going to affect my stamping. So now I can place my stamp directly over the die cut there. I can see through the stamp perfectly to see where I need to go. I'm just taking a little bit of time to make sure that that is lined up really well. And now I can take my stamping platform, I can lift up the stamp, and as you can see, that hasn't moved. As long as the mat underneath doesn't move, the stamp is going to be in the perfect place. Again, I'm going with a dye ink to ensure this dries really quickly. Of course, if you then wanted to go ahead and heat emboss your image, you're best to go for something like a pigment ink, because that is going to stay wetter for much longer. Of course, something like an embossing ink is absolutely perfect. So now I'm just going to press this down onto that cardstock, making sure I press it all over. A really good tool for helping with this is a pressure tool, and we have this available at CraftStash at the moment, again at a brilliant price. So there you can see I've now stamped onto that die cut piece. I'm just going to remove that from the mat. I've got a little bit of paper stuck to my tape there. You could try making your tape a little less tacky if that bothers you. It doesn't bother me in the slightest. That's the reverse of my image. As long as the front is kept nice and clean, that's perfect. So again, thank you, Catherine Pooler, for that tip. Now, Anna Helman came up with a fantastic trick for remembering which way round those dies actually go with the stamps. This is particularly helpful if you're stamping something like a flower that's got loads of petals. So I've got here my made to surprise flowers, and these ones, these florals, some of them are kind of similar sizes and they all look quite similar in that they're almost symmetrical, but not quite, not enough to use the die in any direction. So Anna says, once you have worked out which way your die and your stamp goes, now with this particular one, I know that this point here and this point here go together, so that's how I line this die up. The quickest way to mark this and remember it next time, speed up your crafting, is to just put a little line on the back of your die with a solvent based or an alcohol pen, and do the same on the reverse of the stamp. Now this is not going to affect your stamping or your die cutting, just be sure to let those dry before you put them back in their packets. Now, another additional tip from me is when you do have dies and stamps like this, and as you can imagine, the dies for this set, many of them actually look quite similar. If we take a look, we've got another one there that is kind of just a blob, but they do all cut out different flowers. So once you do know which stamps and dies go together, either letter or number them. Now, because I'm doing lines for which way up they go, I'm going to actually letter these, because otherwise the number 1 could get quite confusing next to that. So I'm going to put an A on the back of this die, and I know that tallies up with this flower, so I'm going to just put a little A on there. This in future, and this is just the stamp packaging, but in future this is going to help me again with finding the coordinating die super quick and then lining it all up. Now, probably the simplest and quickest trick of all is to simply eyeball where you're putting the die. And Simon Hurley on scrapbook.com had some really great ideas on how to get this perfect. So Simon's gone with a technique that uses the stamping first method. So I'm just going to stamp this fun ship's wheel that comes from a Simply Made Crafts stamp set, and I'm just going to pop it onto white cardstock. So for this one, if you don't really have the time to be thinking about maybe cutting yourself a template or die cutting first and then lining up the stamping, if this is the way you like to do it, then Simon just simply suggests lining it up by eye. Now, I would definitely say have your piece of low tack tape already on your finger to stick down and get yourself over your project. So don't worry about if you're trying to film the process, get your head in there and look directly down on your stamped image. So hovering right over here, I'm going to place this in, and as Simon says, just keep an eye out for a perfectly even border. Any stamping that you can use as a reference for whether that's in the center is perfect. Now, if I just move this slightly here as an example, we can see I've got ever such a slight black border down on this left-hand side, so I know that's not central. If we lift it up slightly, we basically kind of have a black border just hovering on the inside of this die all the way around. So I'm going to make sure that's where it sits, and that just means I need another piece of low tack tape. I'm going to pull it up ever so slightly. Now I can see that there is that black border, and it is minute. It's very, very tiny, but I am going to just pop another piece of tape to hold that secure and cut that. See, I've got pretty perfect results there. This is only, of course, going to work if you've got an open die. It's not going to work if you've got a die that's completely solid. So again, thank you, Simon Hurley, for kind of stating the obvious, but giving us some tricks and confidence to do it the original way. Now, this last one is actually quite interesting because it's not actually stamping and die cutting into the same piece. This one from Hutson is all about doing those two techniques on two different layers and then putting them together. So to show you this fun technique, I'm actually going to be stamping and die cutting on two different coloured cardstocks. I'm going to stamp onto one cardstock rather than colour the image in. I'm going to do this directly onto yellow cardstock. It doesn't have to be this way. You can stamp onto white and then colour it in and then still cut white for your background, but we'll cover that in just a moment. First, I'm going to just get this stamped. So I've stamped onto the yellow. I'm then going to die cut an aperture using the die into a different colour cardstock. Now, bear in mind, when you put the two elements together, it's going to look like your top layer that you've die cut into is kind of your background. So whatever colour you'd like your background to be, you want to cut into that colour. So this has eliminated the need for me to die cut around my stamped image at all. Now, this particular die and stamp set actually has some leaves with it in the die but not in the stamp. The idea is that these were die cut just plain and you could colour them afterwards without the stamped image on. So I'm just going to use a stencil brush and just ink through these so that it doesn't look odd when I layer that die cut over the top. Now I can glue my pink layer directly over the top, and it actually looks as if the yellow layer has been stamped and die cut and placed back on top. I'm going to glue these two together so that there's no gap between the two, and then cut around both layers together. So there's the fabulous technique from Hutson, which I just think is absolutely brilliant if you really aren't confident lining those stamps and dies up on the same piece of cardstock. Now, I did promise you one final tip at the end, and this was going back to Catherine Pooler's tip about die cutting first, then putting the die cut in your stamping platform and stamping your image. And I said, this is a brilliant tip, but actually, if we want to keep that small element still without applying glue, this is a way you could do it. So this is our very own CraftStash tip. Now, similar in the way that Catherine Pooler showed us, we are die cutting our shape first and placing it into our stamping platform ready to stamp over the top. But rather than adding glue to the back of this, I'm actually going to use the excess to hold my piece still and in place. So I'm going to just pop the excess down. Now with this, you can of course use your magnets, whereas before you couldn't use your magnets. Then I'm going to place my cardstock or my paper that I've already die cut back into the negative as such of your template. Now you don't need to worry if your die cut piece moves ever so slightly when you lift your stamp up. Let's see what happens. There we go. So that has just moved ever so slightly, but it's going to be able to be placed directly back where it needs to be with the aid of that template. So let's just ink our stamp up, stamp this really funky zebra again, and there we have it again, perfectly lined up. So I hope these tips and tricks have been helpful for you. A huge thanks to all our expert crafters that we've taken the inspiration from. All the videos that we've used these tips from, you'll find linked down in the description. Don't forget to go along and watch their tutorials as well for more helpful hints. As always, please do ensure you're subscribed to the CraftStash YouTube channel for more videos like this, and we think you're also really going to enjoy this tutorial just here. Take care everybody, see you again soon.